Could you ask him why he's not trying to learn English, or whether he's really trying to learn
ਪਾਪਾ ਜੀ ਤੂੰ
English?
ਟਰਾਈ ਕਰਦਾ ਇੰਗਲਿਸ਼ ਲਰਨ ਲਈ ਜਾਂ ਨਹੀਂ?
ਮੇਰਾ ਟਾਈਮ ਹੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਇੰਨਾ ਕਿ ਸਾਡੇ ਆਤੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਨਿੱਕੇ ਨਿੱਕੇ ਕੰਮ 'ਚ ਹੀ ਰਹਿੰਦਾ.
He said he hasn't got any time because he's always at work. He comes home about 7:30.
At school, for example, you get on perfectly well with the white boys, do you?
Yes. But they don't play with me. The white boys don't play with me.
Do they not play with just you, or with any of the coloured
With
boys?
any colour boys.
Why not?
I don't know. Because I've only got 3 friends in my class and they speak to me, but they don't play with me.
3 white friends. Do you play with them? Do you want to play with them?
Yes.
What happens when you try to play with them?
They just say I've got work to do with other friends.
Due to the hills, local climate, and the fact that sheep are the area's most successful livestock, the West Yorkshire town of Huddersfield has a long history of woolen textiles production. The area rapidly industrialised during the 19th century, and the population exploded due to the arrival of economic migrants. People came from other areas of Britain, but also from Ireland and various Eastern European nations. Around the start of the 19th century, Huddersfield housed between 5,000 and 10,000 people, but by the outbreak of the First World War, the town was home to over 100,000 individuals. Despite the town's success being built on immigration and empire, the entry of Commonwealth immigrants into local schools during the 1960s caused a minor panic. Huddersfield became one of 12 education authorities in Britain to disperse immigrant children by bus to schools that were more heavily populated by white children. This documentary is about the history of that event and presents the stories of 4 people who were bused in Huddersfield and of 2 former teachers who worked with immigrant children during the 1960s and 1970s.
I came over with my family in the late 60s. I was quite young, around 7, on the aeroplane looking down and seeing all these sort of little houses and cars flying about, and I thought they were toys and I wanted to get out of the aeroplane and play with them. And it was only until we landed and I had to go through the immigration and these doors opened and it was November and it was freezing cold. This is not what I saw from the top.
I was born in Pakistan and my family moved to Bradford in 65. So we lived in Bradford for a few years and then we moved to Huddersfield. I think the first words I said to my dad, who was carrying me to our home from the airport after we'd arrived, was, there are lots of cars here. And of course, in the village in Pakistan, I would have only seen horses and carts. We moved to Newsham, and that's where I had my first experience of schooling, where I was sent out to a school for Asian children, it would seem at the time.
I was born in Huddersfield and I was bused to school in the 60s and 70s. My father's from Jamaica and my mother's from an island called Anguilla, which is still a British island. They came over in the 60s. My father worked as a trolley bus driver and then a bus driver, and my mother was a nursing orderly at the old Huddersfield Royal Infirmary.
I came to England in August 1964. I didn't go to the junior school, I went straight to Royds Hall Secondary. My dad emigrated first of all, probably about 5-6 years before we came over, and I came over with my mum and my 3 brothers. What I remember is I'm not sure what I was expecting, but when I arrived, it seemed rather grey to me. Maybe I was expecting sunshine, I don't know.
I have done work with people from overseas for many, many years. And I was a teacher and teaching young children. Trevor Bergin was my boss. He employed me as a teacher when he was advisor for the children coming in from overseas. And he was a very successful advisor because he understood what children needed, as he'd been head teacher of one of the schools that had the first children coming in from Pakistan.
During the early 60s, And at that time, of course, there was no government funding or anything. Fortunately, by this time, I was making connections with other individuals who were either head teachers or language leading assistants in other areas. And I helped to form the first National Association for Multiracial Education.
The difficulty for the education departments was, how do you accommodate many children who have no English at all?
And it was in 1963 that we had reached the stage where there were more children from overseas than there were indigenous white children.
And so they tried different ways of dealing with them. And the first way was just to put them into normal school, and they found then that the teachers didn't have the skills to bring on those non-English speaking children, and they were lost really in the system.
27 new arrivals from overseas inside 1 week. None of them spoke English. We had no system. And gradually we evolved with the Education Welfare Department.
And so they came up with the idea of setting up special units, usually in the more rural schools where they'd more space. And so they would have a bus that took them from their area, because in general they lived in close communities.
Busing came about in Huddersfield and 11 other education authorities for several reasons. Commonwealth immigrants ended up living in certain areas of Huddersfield, such as around Spring Grove Primary, where Trevor had been the head teacher. This led to white parents growing scared that their children's education would suffer due to the large number of immigrants. Today we live in a multicultural society. In the 1960s, however, white British society expected immigrants to assimilate into it.
I think the answer to this is not to teach the Yorkshireman Pakistani culture, but to teach the Pakistani Yorkshire culture.
This was part of the attitude behind the government's promotion of busing and councils choosing to implement it. Busing also came about in Huddersfield because there were real logistical issues with teaching immigrants. Some children could not speak English, and many had little or no previous experience of education. Specialist teaching was required to help with these issues, and busing was considered a common-sense way to reduce the extra strain placed on schools and their resources.
They had to see that this load, the extra strain, was borne by all schools where possible.
My parents were told that all the schools were full, and that's why we had to go out to other areas.
Got a letter saying we have to go to certain schools all across Huddersfield. All the black kids who I knew from Roy's Hall, they all got letters saying they were going to Deaton, or they were going to Mount Pleasant, or they were going to Almondbury School. I got a letter saying I had to go to Rowthorpe.
My recollection is that I've always spoken English, and that must have been from just being out on the streets and playing with other children. I think that I would have picked it up, because certainly when I started school, I could speak English, but I had friends that were out on the street as well that were English. I'd wanted to go to the schools that all the local children were going to, so I was a bit upset about it, and I'm sure, I said I didn't really want to go. And what Dad tells me is that, after I was taken to this school, a lot of my friends had told their teachers that I hadn't come to school, or their school, and I think a teacher actually knocked on the door, he said, and said, well, why hasn't your daughter come to school? And Dad said to her, well, she's gone to the immigrant school.
As far as I was aware, I couldn't understand why I couldn't go to the same school as the other children, which the school was nearer. But I ended up having to go to Rowthorpe Infants on the bus with a group of other Afro-Caribbean children, and we went from Fartown to Springwood, dropped some children off there, then went on to Mould Green, dropped some children off there, and then went to Rowthorpe itself. And then in the reverse, going home. But obviously as a young child it was a long day because it was a long journey, the picking up, the dropping off. So it was a long school day.
Obviously I was allocated a place in Millsbridge School, and the coach used to come along and pick us up. I don't know if we had passes for that, but all the kids used to pile in, and we used to pile in as well. And it seemed quite confusing.
I read an article about busing, and something just clicked, and I thought, oh, that's why. That was what was happening. It wasn't because the schools were full. This is the actual process that they were mixing children from different races into white-only areas.
The main reason they did that, but I guess they were frightened because they're thinking there's too many black people congregated in one school.
I found out that it wasn't actually Millsbridge School. It was again an annex to the Millsbridge School. It was just two classes. One, a strictly English one, where there seemed to be indigenous folk, and the other one, ours, which were all bused kids.
There were multiple impulses and reasons behind busing. For example, the policy intended to promote integration. However, due to the fact that no white people were ever bused, this put all of the strain of integration on young immigrants. The idea that British culture was superior also factored into the decision, as did other unpleasant perceptions and beliefs about immigrants. Because of these beliefs, white parents complained about immigrants being educated alongside their children. Their fears were partly based around them genuinely believing that black and Asian people were innately less intelligent and would damage their child's education. For example, Caribbean immigrants were bused despite already speaking English.
I'm sorry, mate. When I arrived in England, no, I wasn't given any English lessons because English is the only language I can speak. Sometimes it's broken, but it is English.
The busing of West Indian children in Huddersfield was run differently from that of Asiatic children. Instead of being bused to special classes, they were spread as evenly as possible around the area's schools. Shockingly, the belief that they generally suffered from educational retardation was the stated reason for busing black people in Huddersfield. It was argued that if they were spread around the schools, black children would be less likely to damage the education of white children.
When we first went to school, obviously I didn't take 11 plus or anything like that, right? So we'd always start in the bottom, the word I'm looking for, the bottom class, the D class. Automatically went into the dunce class.
That it was for somebody who were basically not only failed the 11 plus, but retards almost. That had no idea, which was accurate, because we had no idea what the whole thing was about.
It's also worth noting that back then educators were likely to be unpleasant and abusive towards all children.
And as I walked in past the head study, I thought, oh my goodness, the heating system's in the head's room, because I could hear this swishing noise, and I couldn't understand why it should be there. However, then I saw a team, a group, a queue of children, usually boys, waiting, and so I asked them one day what they were doing. Oh, we're waiting to be hit. We're waiting to be caned. And I said, what do you mean?
I was sat head down doing my work, and he threw a blackboard rubber at me, which actually knocked me out and gave me concussion, to which obviously my parents weren't happy. And rather than them taking out, their aggression on him, I was moved to Birkby Junior School.
However, there were teachers who, like many other white British people during that era, particularly disliked immigrants.
One day, one of the boys was under the table and wouldn't come out because he knew he was having to go to the head to be beaten. So he was a tall boy, and he'd come from Carriacou, small island in the Caribbean. He'd never worn shoes, and he was beaten because he kept walking out of his shoes and leaving them all across the place. He was a fisherman. He was only 7, but he knew how to catch fish, he knew how to sell them in the market, he knew how to take the money, etc. but he didn't fit into the system. And he was crying. So I comforted him and he came and sat on my knee. And I was talking to him. One of the teachers came in, hadn't noticed, and for something, went out again. When I went into the staff room, everybody was sitting looking at me, and this teacher said, "Oh, here she comes. She loves big black boys."
In 1963 or 4, my deputy, a wonderful deputy head lady, had been there. So she was up for interview with me in 58, but she'd been there 10 years, and she came to me and said, "Trevor, I want to leave." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because the Asian children are getting too much help and publicity, and the indigenous white children are being ignored and things."
Nonetheless, in many cases, teachers were well disposed towards immigrant children.
School, I had a really good teacher who, I think because I was so quiet, sort of, took me on board and put me under a wing, and I became very interested in gymnastics. I was always a good gymnast.
I didn't experience any discrimination from the teachers. I had great memories with the teachers, especially the sports one.
We began to attract teachers who wanted the opportunity to work with children who had language difficulties.
So, because of the good work done by people like Trevor, Hazel and many of their colleagues, progress and successes were achieved despite the great deal of barriers in place. However, while many teachers had good intentions in teaching immigrant children, they still held low expectations of their intellectual capabilities and chances of prosperity.
Learners, do you find?
I do find that, yes. I seem to pick them up very quickly, but of course things like lawnmower, they've never seen a lawnmower in their life before, and they're not likely to with some of these, so.
In terms of the schooling, I think as my kids are going to nursery, it felt like a bit like that. We weren't really pushed, we weren't really encouraged that much. I think there were minimal effort to educate us.
They didn't seem to expect black people to be academic in any sense, meaning you always started in the bottom group.
I was a bit bored, to be honest, just sort of wandering aimlessly round the classroom. Made friends and we played nice games together, imaginative games and things, which I enjoyed, but it wasn't what I imagined school would be like, or, what I was hoping to get out of school. Until one day I decided that I'd had enough and I just wanted to go home. And I told my friend that I was going home, and I must have been, how old would I have been? About 5, possibly? And I just walked out of the school.
Despite being the result of unpleasant assumptions and creating social disadvantages, busing may have actually helped Caribbean children in particular to integrate in Huddersfield. What's more, the schools in the countryside that immigrant children were bused to were often of a better quality than the ones they would have attended nearer the town centre.
When I went to high school, after being bused into school, I missed that bus journey, to be honest. I missed seeing the world go by for the first, hour and a half of my day. I did miss it. I'd formed relationships at the infants and junior school, and I missed them. And as I said, then going up to high school, it was a little bit traumatic because, as I say, it was children that I didn't know, and it was an environment that I didn't know, even though it was in my own community. At Fartown, so it was, I did miss the busing.
Being bused seemed like a privilege at the time, because all you had to do was get up and go and stand around the corner, which was about 30 yards from the home, and you were picked up. Nice new coaches.
I got a good education because from leaving Royds Hall and shipped off to Rawthorpe. My time at Rawthorpe was brilliant.
I was receiving end, but I don't think that the complementary nature of ethnic minorities and indigenous would have developed like it did. I think that the fact that it was a decent place to live. I always, now I'm 91 now, and I compare the problems of the third generations. We had the first generation settlers, and I use the word selectively. There was a lot of love.
Although for some, busing had good intentions, it still created social and educational disadvantages for immigrant children.
When the children were dispersed by bus from their local area out to a school quite some distance away, it worked well to teach them English because they were in their own group and they were taught intensively English. But they made no friendships with the local children, and so it didn't help in cohesion and bringing the communities together. So in one way it was very successful. In the other way, about cohesion and integration, it was a failure.
It was completely segregated. I think it was segregated because we were coming from outside and they were and being taken by a bus, whereas they would finish the school and be walking home. I think walking home is quite critical to forming relationships and friendships. But if you just dropped in, dropped out, I think you are left isolated.
The white parents in the school quite often would go to the head and at the parents' meetings would object to having children coming into the school who didn't speak English because they felt that their own children would be held back in their learning.
While Asian children were essentially segregated due to busing, it meant that Caribbean children were often the only member of their ethnic group in their class. In different ways, it is possible that this could have led to the development of inferiority complexes amongst children of both groups.
Sports day, and the school kids were put into 4 groups. The other lads were white, and one of them was quite chubby. And before the race, he bullied me that I should come last because it would be embarrassing for him because he were fat and he was white if he came last. And I was quite frightened, and that's what I did. I was ashamed of being a migrant, coming here, leaving a country and don't know what the situation, why the situation.
One of the boys was very dark-skinned, and there were other children who were from the Caribbean, but he must have decided that he didn't want to be black, he wanted to be white. And one day during break, while I went to the staff room and had a coffee, he'd stayed in the classroom and he'd taken the chalk from the board and he'd covered his face with white chalk. You could just see his eyes and his mouth. And when I came back, he was so proud and said, "I'm white now. I'm not a black boy, I'm white now."
Despite busing representing regressive attitudes towards immigrants, it was also part of the genuine attempts of progressive educators like Trevor and Hazel to create the more integrated and multicultural society that we live in today.
We've always tried to explain to parents, and we've got a far shrewder parent than a lot of people give us credit for. And when they can appreciate, if we present the facts honestly and squarely to them, that their children are going to grow up, whether they like it or not, whether it's acceptable to them or not, that their children are going to grow up in a multiracial society, that the only place for their children to learn to live in this society is in the school.
The story of busing and the entry of the first generation of Commonwealth children into British schools is not well known. However, it was an event which played a part in shaping the society we live in today. In 2005, Bernard Cord, who exposed the scandal of immigrants being more likely to get classified as educationally subnormal than white children, argued that when society fails one generation, it lays the foundations for similar, even worse failures in the generations to follow. In 2012, one London head teacher publicly stated that busing needed to be brought back to promote integration. In 2016, Trevor Phillips, the former chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, suggested that numbers of Muslim pupils in schools should be limited for the same reason. Today, it is easy to see that the social issues relating to busing have not disappeared. We should, however, listen to those who were affected by these issues in the recent past and learn from the mistakes of a policy which overburdened particular groups of children because they were supposedly different or a problem.